What does a nation do with the largest, most heavily armored battleship ever built, once the entire kind of war it was designed to fight has already stopped existing? Japan's answer was to send it out anyway, into the East China Sea, with almost no air cover, barely enough fuel to reach its destination, and a crew that already understands this is a one-way mission before they've even left port. Its target is the American invasion fleet supporting the assault on Okinawa, and its orders amount to a suicide run. Beach itself if necessary, and keep fighting as a stationary gun platform until it's destroyed. Within 2 hours of American carrier aircraft finding it, more than 2,700 of its roughly 3,300-man crew will be dead, and the ship Japan poured a staggering share of its wartime steel, resources and national prestige into building will be sitting on the bottom of the ocean. This is the story of the Yamato, a ship built to be the ultimate expression of naval power in an era that was already ending by the time it was finished, and the 2 hours that proved just how completely the age of the battleship had been replaced by the age of the aircraft carrier. To understand why Japan built something as extreme as the Yamato, you have to understand the strategic thinking that shaped Japanese naval doctrine in the years leading up to the war. Japanese naval planners in the 1930s were operating under a set of international treaty restrictions, most significantly the Washington Naval Treaty and its successors, which limited the total tonnage and size of capital ships that major naval powers were permitted to build. Japan formally withdrew from those treaty limitations in the mid-1930s, freeing its naval architects to design ships without the size caps that had constrained the rest of the world's navies for over a decade. Japan's strategic thinking at the time still centered heavily around the idea of a single decisive fleet engagement, a modern echo of the very kind of overwhelming victory Japan's own navy had achieved decades earlier at Tsushima, where a smaller, better prepared force had annihilated a larger enemy fleet in one afternoon. Japanese planners reasoned that since they could never realistically outproduce the United States in total number of ships, given the disparity in industrial capacity between the two countries, the answer was to build individual ships so powerful, so heavily armored, and so devastatingly armed that they could defeat multiple American battleships, each in direct combat, offsetting Japan's numerical disadvantage through sheer per-ship supremacy. The result of that thinking was the Yamato-class battleship, and the numbers involved remain genuinely staggering, even by the standards of naval history. The Yamato displaced roughly 72,000 tons at full load, making it, along with its sister ship Musashi, the heaviest and most powerfully armed battleship ever put to sea, a distinction neither has ever lost even decades later. Its main armament consisted of 9 18 1-inch guns, the largest naval guns ever mounted on any warship in history, each capable of firing a shell weighing well over a ton to distances of more than 25 miles. Its armor belt, protecting its hull and critical systems, was designed to withstand hits from the largest guns any potential enemy battleship might carry. Construction took place under an extraordinary level of secrecy at the Kura Naval Arsenal, with Japanese authorities going to remarkable lengths to conceal the ship's true dimensions and specifications from foreign intelligence services, including erecting massive rope and camouflage screens around the dry dock, restricting worker access on a need-to-know basis, and even reportedly relocating a nearby rope factory whose workers might have had a clear vantage point onto the construction site. The scale of the secrecy worked remarkably well. American naval intelligence throughout most of the war significantly underestimated the true size and armament of the Yamato-class ships, and accurate American assessments of the vessel's specifications didn't fully solidify until well after the war had ended. The ship was laid down in 1937 and commissioned in December 1941, just days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a piece of timing that, in hindsight, captures perfectly how quickly the entire strategic assumption behind the ship's design was about to become obsolete. The Yamato had a sister ship, the Musashi, built to the same staggering specifications and commissioned roughly a year later. The two vessels represented the complete production run of a planned larger class that Japan's wartime industrial capacity, especially once the fighting began consuming steel and resources at unsustainable rates, was never able to fully realize. Their third hull, intended to become a battleship named Shinano, was converted mid-construction into an aircraft carrier instead. Itself a quiet, telling admission from within the Japanese Navy that the age of the battleship was already giving way to the age of the carrier, even before either the Yamato or Musashi had fired a shot in anger. Here's the brutal irony sitting at the center of the Yamato's entire story. The very attack that helped make its existence globally known, Pearl Harbor, was also proof of the exact strategic shift that would render the Yamato's fundamental design philosophy obsolete before it ever fired its main guns in a decisive fleet battle. Pearl Harbor wasn't won by battleships trading massive shells at long range. It was executed entirely by carrier-based aircraft, striking from beyond the range of the battleships they targeted, sinking or crippling much of the American Pacific battle fleet in a matter of hours without a single American battleship ever getting a clear shot at a Japanese ship in return. That lesson, delivered by Japan's own Navy at Pearl Harbor and reinforced repeatedly throughout the early carrier battles of the Pacific War, meant that by the time the Yamato was ready for extended combat operations, the entire premise behind building it, that a single supremely powerful battleship could dominate an enemy fleet in direct gunnery combat, was already being overtaken by a new form of naval warfare where aircraft carriers, not battleships, decided the outcome of major engagements from ranges no battleship gun could ever reach. The Yamato had been designed to win the last war. It entered active service just as the next one was already being fought by different rules entirely. For much of the Pacific War, the Yamato's actual combat role fell dramatically short of the decisive, war-defining battles its designers had envisioned. Japanese naval commanders, increasingly aware of how valuable and vulnerable the ship was, and increasingly short on the fuel needed to operate such a massive vessel freely, kept it largely in reserve at various naval bases for extended periods, earning it something of a nickname among sailors elsewhere in the fleet. The Hotel Yamato, a jab at a ship widely perceived as spending far more time anchored safely in port than actually engaging the enemy. The ship did see limited action during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, one of the largest naval battles in history, where it participated in an engagement against a group of American escort carriers and destroyers off Samar, contributing to the sinking of some American vessels during that specific action, before ultimately withdrawing along with the rest of its task force under circumstances still debated by historians. The Musashi, its sister ship, met its own end during that same broader Battle of Leyte Gulf, sunk in the Sibuyan Sea in October 1944 after being struck by a similarly overwhelming number of American carrier aircraft, somewhere in the range of 17 bomb hits and nearly 20 torpedo hits by various accounts, a battering that took hours rather than the two the Yamato would later endure, but that delivered essentially the same verdict on the entire concept behind both ships. By the time the Yamato sailed on its own final mission 5 months later, its sister ship had already demonstrated, in brutal and unambiguous terms, exactly what a concentrated American carrier airstrike could do to even the most heavily armored battleship ever built. But the Yamato never got the singular decisive fleet battle against American battleships that its entire design had been built around. By early 1945, with Japan's naval position collapsing on every front and the war closing in toward the home islands themselves, the Yamato's role shifted from a symbol of Japan's naval might to something closer to a final desperate gesture. That gesture arrived in the form of Operation Tengo, launched on April 7, 1945, as American forces pressed their invasion of Okinawa, the last major island standing between Allied forces and a direct invasion of the Japanese home islands. The plan called for the Yamato, escorted by a light cruiser and a handful of destroyers, to sail south and attack the American fleet supporting the Okinawa landings. Critically, the mission was assigned virtually no air cover. Japan's carrier aviation had been effectively destroyed in earlier battles, and the aircraft that remained were being reserved primarily for kamikaze operations against the invasion fleet directly. The fuel situation alone tells you almost everything about how desperate the mission actually was. Some historical accounts indicate the Yamato was loaded with only enough fuel for a one-way voyage, reflecting the reality that Japan's fuel reserves, The same reserves whose scarcity had helped push Japan toward war back in 1941 had by this point in the war been reduced to levels that made a genuine round-trip operation for a ship this size essentially impossible to sustain. The mission amounted, in practical terms, to sending the largest battleship ever built on a deliberate one-way suicide run, with orders to beach itself near Okinawa if it survived long enough to arrive, and continue fighting as a fixed gun position for as long as it could hold out. Command of the mission fell to Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, and multiple historical accounts describe him as deeply skeptical of the operation's chances from the outset, understanding better than almost anyone involved just how exposed the task force would be without meaningful air cover, against an enemy that had spent the previous 3 years demonstrating repeatedly what carrier aviation could do to even well-defended surface ships. He reportedly only agreed to lead the mission after being told directly that the operation carried symbolic importance beyond its tactical odds, a final gesture meant to demonstrate the Imperial Navy's willingness to fight to the last, coordinated loosely with the broader wave of kamikaze attacks being launched against the American invasion fleet at Okinawa during the same period. Some surviving accounts describe officers within the task force openly discussing among themselves before departure that they did not expect to return, treating the mission less as a viable combat operation and more as an honorable, if largely symbolic, final act. Within the Japanese naval command structure, Operation Tengo remains one of the more debated decisions of the entire Pacific War, and not simply in hindsight. Some officers reportedly raised objections at the time it was being planned. The core tactical argument against it was straightforward: sending a fleet's last major surface combatant on a mission with no realistic prospect of surviving American air power, let alone accomplishing its stated objective of disrupting the Okinawa landings, offered little practical military value, while guaranteeing the loss of thousands of trained sailors who might otherwise have contributed to homeland defense in the war's final months. The counter-argument, favored by the naval leadership that ultimately approved the mission, centered on morale and symbolism, a conviction that allowing the Navy's most powerful remaining ship to sit passively in port while soldiers and kamikaze pilots died defending Okinawa would represent its own kind of failure, regardless of the mission's actual military prospects. Everyone involved on the Japanese side already knew how this ends. Stick around for what happens when 386 American aircraft actually find them, and if you haven't hit subscribe yet, now's a good moment. American forces detected the Yamato task force shortly after it departed Japanese waters, and carrier aircraft from Task Force 58 were launched to intercept it well before it could reach Okinawa. Roughly 386 American aircraft, a combination of dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters providing escort, converged on the Yamato and its small, hopelessly outmatched escort group. The attack unfolded in relentless, coordinated waves. American pilots targeted the Yamato's hull with torpedoes, specifically aimed at concentrating damage on one side of the ship, a tactic designed to induce catastrophic flooding and capsizing rather than spreading damage evenly across the hull. Bombs struck its superstructure and deck repeatedly. Despite the ship's famously heavy armor, the sheer volume and coordination of the attack overwhelmed its defenses within a remarkably short window. Multiple torpedo hits concentrated on the port side eventually caused the ship to list dramatically, and roughly 2 hours after the attack began, the Yamato capsized and its forward magazines detonated in a massive explosion. Witnesses among the American pilots, some flying from as far as 70 miles away, described watching a column of fire and smoke climb roughly 6 kilometers into the sky, a fireball so large it was visible from a startling distance across open ocean. Not a nuclear detonation, which was still months away from the world's first use, but the result of the Yamato's own massive ammunition stores igniting all at once as the ship broke apart and sank. The human cost matched the almost unreal scale of everything else about this ship. Of a crew numbering somewhere around 3,300 men, official estimates placed the death toll at roughly 2,700 to 3,000 sailors and officers, an almost total loss of the ship's complement in a single, brief engagement. American losses in the attack, by dramatic contrast, amounted to a small handful of aircraft and airmen, a lopsidedness in casualties that echoed, in its own grim way, the same kind of overwhelming, one-sided outcome that had characterized the Battle of Tsushima 4 decades earlier, though this time with the roles of overwhelming victor and devastated loser, completely reversed from that earlier chapter of Japanese naval history. Survivor accounts collected after the war describe scenes of chaos and desperation, as the ship listed and eventually capsized. Men trapped below decks as compartments flooded, others thrown into burning fuel oil on the water's surface as the ship broke apart. Rescue efforts by the handful of surviving escort vessels hampered by continued American air attacks, even as the Yamato was sinking. It stands as one of the deadliest single ship losses in naval history, a catastrophic final chapter for a vessel that had, for most of its operational life, spent far more time anchored in port than engaged in the kind of decisive combat its designers had originally envisioned for it. Vice Admiral Ito, the officer who had reportedly gone into the mission already convinced of its futility, went down with his ship, choosing, according to survivor testimony, to remain in his command quarters as the vessel capsized rather than attempt to escape. A final grim confirmation of just how completely the mission's participants understood from the outset what kind of operation they had actually been sent on. The raw numbers make for a great headline, but underneath them, the Yamato's story is really a case study in the danger of preparing brilliantly for the wrong war. Japan's naval planners weren't incompetent. They correctly understood, in the specific terms of naval doctrine as it had existed for the previous several decades, that a heavily armored, immensely powerful battleship represented a rational way to offset a numerical disadvantage against a larger industrial rival. What they couldn't fully anticipate, or perhaps simply couldn't adjust to quickly enough once it became clear, was that the entire framework of decisive battleship versus battleship combat that had justified the Yamato's existence was itself being replaced in real time by carrier aviation, a shift Japan's own attack on Pearl Harbor had helped demonstrate to the rest of the world. The Yamato never got to fight the battle it was built for. It spent most of the war anchored, waiting for a decisive fleet engagement that the changing nature of naval warfare had already rendered increasingly unlikely to ever happen on the terms its designers imagined, and it ultimately died not in the massive ship-to-ship gunnery duel its 9 18-inch guns had been built to dominate, but under a swarm of aircraft it had almost no ability to defend against. In a mission, its own fuel reserves barely allowed it to complete one way. There's a reason military historians frequently point to the sinking of the Yamato as one of the clearest, most symbolically complete illustrations of the battleship era's end. This wasn't a close engagement decided by fine margins or exceptional skill on one side. It was the single largest, most heavily armored battleship ever constructed, destroyed almost entirely by aircraft, in under 2 hours, without ever coming within range of firing its main guns at another battleship in the kind of decisive engagement it had been purpose-built to win. Within months of the Yamato's sinking, the war in the Pacific would end entirely, closed out not by any battleship engagement at all, but by aircraft delivering the 2 atomic bombs that finally brought Japan's surrender in August 1945. A final, almost poetic confirmation that the era the Yamato represented, an era of naval power measured in armor thickness and gun caliber, had already ended before the ship carrying its ultimate expression ever got the fight it was built for. The wreck itself was eventually located decades later, resting broken on the seafloor, roughly 200 nautical miles from the Japanese coast, split into multiple large sections by the force of the magazine explosion that ended it. It remains to this day a site of quiet remembrance for a ship that has become, in the decades since the war, almost as much a cultural symbol in Japan as a military one, referenced repeatedly in Japanese film, television, and popular culture as shorthand for the entire arc of the country's wartime experience. Extraordinary engineering ambition, deployed too late against an enemy that had already moved on to a different kind of war entirely. That closes out this run of 6 stories, from a battle that never happened starting a war that killed millions, to the largest battleship ever built going down in less time than it takes to watch 2 feature films back to back. If any one of these hit different for you, let us know which one in the comments. And if you want more of these deep dives into the decisions, mistakes, and turning points that actually shaped how these wars played out, subscribe and stick around. There's a lot more where this came from.